Hello and welcome to JH UK. I'm Priscilla Nwekpo, and on the panel this week are journalist and broadcaster Eno Adeogun, journalist Richard Sudan, and the owner and founder of Naturally Tribal, Shalom Lloyd. Well, welcome to the program, all of you. Good to have you here this week.
Thank you.
Let's start with Brexit. Here in the UK, politicians are discussing Theresa May's deal to leave the EU. They'll continue to do so until they vote on whether to accept or reject it on Tuesday, the 11th. Can they really reject this come 29th of May? We heard the EU saying that you can stay, you can reverse it if you want to, it's not a problem. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But can the UK still reject this deal? I know a lot of parliamentarians have been saying, oh, we're going to reject it, it's not good enough. And I don't know, how do you see this?
I definitely think that it can be rejected under the terms that have been presented now, even with, the fact that Theresa May was told that, the government, you will be held in contempt of Parliament if you do not let us know exactly what the conditions are going to be, the advice that's been given by the Attorney General. And I saw it as like an arrogance to feel you've been told this and you still felt that you could present an overview of what's going to happen. And for me, ultimately, whether or not you voted to leave or remain, Theresa May ran, in a general election under a manifesto that people voted for, thinking that certain things were going to be put into place if and when we leave the EU.
Is it a case of that deal is so bad that if it's rejected, then we're going to end up with a no-deal Brexit? Do you think that's going to happen, Shalom?
I think Theresa May is in a very difficult situation. I'm pro-Theresa. I think she's is a poison chalice. Damned if she does and damned if she doesn't. I mean, listening to her on the news this morning, there were three options as far as she was concerned. Take a deal which she feels is a good deal, no deal at all, or, back to the drawing board.
We've heard so much about this deal. What I don't hear from the opposition is what the alternative is.
Absolutely.
For those who are rejecting or saying they're going to reject, they're not saying we're going to reject and let's have a look at ABC, X, Y, and Z. So really, in a situation like that, surely she's right then, isn't she? To, because she's the only person that's presenting something that we can all identify with to a point, save for the backstop, of course. Richard.
I don't necessarily agree with that. I think if you look at most sort of serious economists and analysts, they're telling you very clearly, from the London School of Economics to Oxford to sort of individual economists, they're saying there's no deal better than the one we have now, economically.
You mean staying in?
Absolutely, there is no better deal than the one.
I know, but we've gone past that.
But the key thing here that needs to be mentioned is that the entire campaign was based on lies. There's not one thing, both in terms of the forces that led the campaign, if you like, anti-immigration, and also the economic argument. Every single point has been...
But the Leavers will not agree with you on that. The Leavers will say that, they knew what they were voting for, that, they understood what it was about. Maybe they may have an issue with the whole, how much we were going to give the NHS, but they would say the rest of it was perfectly fine.
No, but this is, sorry, but I think this is the perfect deal for someone that is a Remainer, because we're still going to remain so closely allied to the EU.
Our geography doesn't change, as she says.
And the fact that there's this, that we could remain indefinitely now in the customs union, that's what came out when we had the full picture of what the Attorney General had advised. So in that sense, if you voted to leave the EU, you were voting to leave the customs union, you were voting to leave.
But did they understand though?
Yeah. Exactly.
That they were voting to leave the customs
on that basis,
union.
that's why it's a bad deal. That's why she's got her closest allies that are saying this is a bad deal, because it doesn't deliver what she promised.
But Shalom, do you think that the EU will accept an alternative deal?
But the intent, let's look at the intent. For me, I look at the intent.
Yeah.
I'm assuming good intent from the part of Theresa May. And like you mentioned before, what are you bringing to the table? It's all well and good standing there and saying this deal is rubbish, it's not good for us. But what are you bringing to the table? I think it's egg on our face, because I think the whole world is sitting there, watch us, scrambling, as opposed to thinking the intent is to make this exit as seamless and as best for the people who voted to leave?
I don't have such an optimistic view about Theresa May. Let's remember, Theresa May essentially threatened the EU about 6 months ago. Right. She actually threatened to not pay the divorce bill. This is not how you do business, going into a future where you're leaving the EU. And of course, the one thing we're not talking about is the perception of Britain and the UK, how this is affecting our image. And the world is essentially looking in and saying, wow, Britain, whenever you think about the neoliberal economics of the EU, of which I'm not a fan, just look at Greece, it's still surely better to be at the table than to walk away. This politics of nativism, isolationism, it's really damaging to the image of the UK, but the main focus for me has to be the plight of the most vulnerable in the UK. The condition of immigrants, working class people, the most vulnerable, is going to be made much worse by leaving the EU. All the evidence shows
I hear that, and there you mentioned about Theresa May and how we look to the world. But then there's this issue of the vote of no confidence. We've been talking about, there's been an attempt from the get-go to quite literally get rid of Mrs. May. Let's not look at it any different. So the threat of no confidence has been spoken. And here we are again. If that does happen, what do we think is going to happen next? With all what you're saying, Richard, what you're saying doesn't appear to have been taken into consideration when it comes to this push for, a vote of no confidence. It's just been so hard.
Based on the evidence, I think if Theresa May was to be forced to leave, or she chose to leave now, I think based on the conditions on the ground, something more right-wing, something more reactionary is going to take her place. There's no evidence to suggest that there's going to be something to the left, if you like, or something more welcoming, because right now the world is looking at Britain, and essentially we can all talk about the merits and the legitimate arguments for leaving, but everyone knows the fact of the matter is we had the referendum because of immigration. And I think if Britain knew the true history of immigration in this country...
When you say Britain, do you mean Britain as in the ordinary man on the street, or you mean Britain as government? Because as government, I think they would have known about immigration and
I agree with you.
Immigration. But I think but I think the man on the street who was asked to vote, and also using the immigration rhetoric, as you say, probably did not understand quite the depth.
Can I make one quick distinction here, if I may?
Please.
Just quickly, the whole referendum was actually called because of Eurosceptics within the Tory party. They might be racist, but these Eurosceptics is a different sort of racism. They had a grand vision of empire, a kind of nostalgia for empire, if you like. But when the referendum was called, the ticket on the ground amongst ordinary working people was a revulsion, anger against the establishment, which was correct. But the analysis which blamed immigrants, other members of their working class, if you like, was incorrect. That's the way I look at it.
You say that, but immigrants were part of those who voted to leave.
I was going to say, but for me, that's done. I'm talking from a business perspective now. Sure. As a small business owner, I look at Brexit and I think, okay, it's actually kind of causing a little bit of a mayhem. I understand that. However, it is what it is. We've got to accept the people have spoken and move on. For me, it's about what are the opportunities out there. How do we take it forward? And as a small business, I'm thinking, okay, there is a unit that is made up of 53 countries, a unit that gives you access to 2.4 billion people. That's the Commonwealth. So for my business, I'm thinking, okay, until we sort out what's happening with the EU, let me look at this as an opportunity to actually trade, etc. Absolutely. It's something that we have that is established. But, I think people look at the EU and think, that's all we've got.
And there's this whole talk of we could do Norway style deal. Norway style deal always existed. Back to what Richard was saying, with Norway, are we still at the table? We're not. But we were at the table before we got there.
We just leave Ireland in the corner to just.
But then, given where we're at,
yeah,
is that our best option now?
The thing is, I hate to have to. I never thought this day would come, to quote Donald Trump.
Oh God.
But we are in a mess. We're in a real mess, I think. And going back to the last question you were asking about with Theresa May voting no confidence, do people genuinely have confidence in her now? I'm not sure. Do I think that there should be, if there's a general election, am I confident who I think could lead the country? Is that Jeremy Corbyn? Is that Jacob Rees-Mogg? No, I don't have confidence in that either. So that's why I don't know what the solution is. And you would hope the people you elect to be, to represent us would have a solution. They don't seem to have a solution. Yeah. They're saying this is a bad deal. So what's the good deal? What does that look like?
Having said that, the question of people's vote has been huge. That we can't ignore that. People are demanding for it. But then, you know, now there's a suggestion that people's vote is like a rejection of democracy. I mean, Shalom, do you see it that way? Is it a rejection of democracy? I thought democracy was all about everybody's participation.
I think Brexit demonstrates democracy. I mean, I love exactly what you said. What is the plan B? Okay, so we're all saying, Teresa's, you know, there's no confidence there, but you just said it. Who do you have confidence in? So for me, it's to look at what do we have today and how can we make it work?
But I wish we could continue and break down that whole voting thing. But for the time being, we do have to take a quick break. We'll be right back because we have so much more to discuss. Don't go away. Hello and welcome back to JHUK. I'm Priscilla Winkwa and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel. In a survey published last month, nearly a third of Nigerians said they had shared a political news story online that turned out to be fake. One such story suggested President Buhari was an imposter who had been cloned, a story which the president himself addressed when he was asked about the rumors in Poland. This is what he had to say.
Yes, there's one important question. I tend to forget about it because the answers of that question must be ignorant and irreligious. Somebody thought that I'm cloned. No wonder I forgot it until I was reminded by it. Yes, a lot of people hoped that I was dead. And hoped I died. And poor Vice President, and some people have started, in fact, asking for his office whether he should consider them for being the Vice President because I was dead. They must have embarrassed him a lot because he visited me when I was in London convalescent. But it's really me, I assure you.
So, Shalom, I'm going to come to you first on this. Yeah. Why are you laughing?
Because I don't think this should be news. Why are we even talking about this when there's so many more important things out there to talk about? I understand why, but it's just...
I think it's particularly important because, you know, we're not looking at this story in particular as it is, but we're looking more at the stories around it, which brings me to my question. Are Nigerians particularly susceptible to rumors and fake news?
I think yes. I think it's all about trust. When you don't trust the news you're getting locally, and because the channels are now open with social media and the digital age now. I mean, we have access to so much information: true, false, fake. It's almost like pick which one you like, which one sounds truest, and share it, edit it, you know, make it sound like you want it to type thing. But ultimately, it boils down to trust for me.
I mean, why do you think that we're in a time now where, because we're all reporters, every single one of us are recording things on our phones, we're posting things online, you would have thought that with that it would be more, you know, things would be more factual, but they're not. Why do you think we're seeing so much of it now?
And I think we do see some good sort of investigations on the positive front, but I think definitely there's a number of factors that go into this: a lack of trust in politicians, a lack of trust in the media. We're laughing at the video we just watched, but I think it's quite worrying actually. A head of state is having to come on TV and essentially declare, I've not been cloned, I'm not dead, when things like minimum wage and other important issues are being talked about. It does seem like a big distraction, but yeah, ultimately a worry that people just embrace such wild conspiracy theories. It's not unique to Nigeria though, you're seeing it all across the world.
Yeah, that I think that's the main point as well, that people are laughing at this story and essentially laughing at gullible Nigerians believing nonsense, as they put it. But even this buzzword of fake news, that came from the President of the United States, which highlights the fact that this isn't a unique problem that Nigerians are going through. India's also, they've seen a huge rise in just fake news spreading. And sometimes, I mean, in this case, we're laughing, we're saying, oh, is the president, has he been cloned or not? Like fake news can lead to mobs turning out killing people,
Yeah.
beating people. Tension can arise as a result of the misinformation of when information is
It's
spread
impacted
falsely.
elections as well, fake news,
Yeah.
you know.
Oh, yes.
Fake news was decisive in the Brexit referendum and the Trump election, and it's been proven.
That's very true. I mean, one of the things that was also found in this report is that Nigerians were said to have been a lot more susceptible to this because they were sharing more stories using WhatsApp. And so my question really here is social media fueling this?
The good thing is, though, I think that Nigerians are asking more questions. I remember when there was a rumour that the government is going to put a cap on how many children that people can have, whereas the minister in question had literally just been talking about child spacing. And very quickly, within a day, with Nigerians were asking on Twitter, who said this? When did this happen? Within a day, the minister came forward and she tweeted her response that, no, this is what I actually said, and it was cleared up. And I felt very proud that Nigerians are asking questions. So as many people that are saying Buhari has been cloned, you also have people saying, well, this is nonsense. They're questioning that, and there's an interesting dialogue, which to me shows that Nigerians aren't just silly accepting fake news, but then it's still an issue that does need to be addressed because a lot of people are believing it as well.
I agree with you. It's a double-edged sword, really, because I think the digital age, social media, everything is technology-enabled now, and it can make or break a business, a government. But one thing it does do is, rightfully or wrongly, give people a voice. And I think it's doing that really well. Sometimes negatively in terms of, social media, things flying out through WhatsApp, but at least finally people have a way of communicating to the outside world.
Yeah. This report also said that Nigerians, for them, they were the ones that had the lowest level of trust. Kenya was also part of the report. South Africa was also part of the report. But Nigeria came up, number one. Why do we think that is? Because, journalists were the ones that were relied on when governments will fail to be able to tell us what is really going on. Why is it that in a country like Nigeria, that's not the case at the moment?
Show me any person that will say to you, I trust my government. I don't know anybody that would say they trust their government. So again, this is I dare say there's differing levels of it, but this is a global thing you're seeing right now. And part of it is a kind of, you're seeing the limitations or the failure of the kind of the global sort of money system, if you like, the war machine. A big part of our world has been predicated on a system that doesn't work. And now it's being brought to its knees. You're seeing economic crashes, you're seeing social upheaval. So everything's coming into question, in my opinion. And that means people are questioning everything.
I wish we had more time to get deeper into what Richard was saying there. But we do have to have this other part of the conversation, and that is that in Nigeria, negotiations, as you mentioned, for the new minimum wage are still ongoing. Most recently, the state governors declared that they could not afford to pay 30,000 naira, which is around £85 per month, that had been agreed between the government, employers and the labour representatives, and came up with a new figure of 22,500 naira, around £75. This figure has angered the negotiators, who consider the governor's decision to become more involved at this time as merely politicking. The indecision over the minimum wage is in contrast to Africa's second biggest economy, South Africa, where the government has proposed increasing the minimum wage to the equivalent of £199 per month. I saw Shalom's face there out of the corner of my eye, but I'm going to come to you, Eno.
I heard you say about South Africa's second largest economy. So who's the first largest economy?
Take a wild guess. The giant of Africa, Nigeria.
Nigeria. It's interesting when the politics is going on and they're running around. They're going to their whole areas and broadcasting, saying what they're going to do. When they come into power, nothing. Civil servants don't get paid for 6 months to 1 year, and then we accept it as normality. And yet we call ourselves giant of Africa.
Now, Richard, Nigerian politicians, especially those in the National Assembly, are reported to earn the highest salary in the world. Why do you think they're struggling to be able to pay this minimum wage that it's, £75?
Looking at some of the comments online, there's clearly the ability to do it, but again, it's the political will, as you see the world over. So I think, generally speaking, calls for a living, like working wage to be law, has to be supported. But yeah, the political will is always the problem. You know, how do people rally their politicians to call for it?
I hear you. And I mean, these figures are referring to, by the way, civil servants, and not, you know, the South African figures are referring to domestic workers, and in Nigeria we're talking about civil servants. Right. Can it be justified to, you know, have this disparity when compared?
Now this is where we should be talking about what's embarrassing. This news is embarrassing. I mean, when I was in Nigeria, I had a nanny and I was paying the nanny 30,000, and people were like, oh my gosh, that's big money. And the thinking behind that was that this is someone that's going to be in my home looking after my child. If she values her job, knowing that, oh, if I might not get paid this amount if I leave, then she will, the work that she's doing will be good. And shouldn't that be the mindset of our leaders as well in Nigeria? Shouldn't they feel these are civil servants, unless you're saying the work that they're doing as civil servants is meaningless?
But then you're talking about ordinary Nigerians thinking in that way. So it's not just a problem of the civil servant, of the government, for instance, but it's probably a problem of the nation.
Definitely, but even if a civil servant isn't even going to be looked upon by people in power as doing important work, how less so for the person that is a shopkeeper or working, that's someone that's an attendant that's putting petrol into your car. There's no appreciation on any level.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time on this one. Well, time for us to take a very quick break, but we'll still have lots more to discuss. So please join us in a few moments. Hello and welcome back to JHUK. In France, fuel tax rises, which led to weeks of violent protests, have been postponed for 6 months. The decision was made at around the same time the governor of Nairobi was forced to abandon a decision to ban minibuses known as matatos from the center of the capital. Two countries attempting to deal with congestion and climate change in their capital cities, both forced to rethink due to public pressure. Interesting that public pressure is, you know, actually having an impact on government. It's good to see that. But then, you know, in both countries, protesters were angry at the decision that seemed to impact the poorest and the most vulnerable. We've, you know, mentioned that. You've mentioned that a lot, Richard. Members of society. Do we see any parallels in, you know, people power here and all of that? And I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always good to see when people make a stand, when the government listen. That was the whole purpose. They are meant to have their jobs. I'm not saying that takes away from what leaders are when they are trying to make positive changes. The environment, it's important. We all need to care about this type of thing. But if there's not a contingency plan put in place, I always link back to Nigeria somehow. All roads lead back to Nigeria. But when they tried, it's like banning Okadas, the bikes, that people will, you know, that's their business. If you've got a way of doing things and there's nothing that's put in place to deal with the change, then of course it doesn't make sense. Not that what you're trying to do isn't a good thing, but there needs to be a way that those that are most vulnerable in society are not the most affected. The rich people, you ban buses, they weren't even getting on buses in the first place. They don't care.
I hear you, and you know, the whole subject issue of contingency plan was, I think, what played out the most in Kenya, in the sense that there was no other plan in place, and we know that the public transport system in Kenya, you don't have a variation as we, you know, you probably have trains and overhead trains and, you know, different types of modes of transportation for the people. But are there any lessons learned here, you know, to try and limit the harm that is done to the most vulnerable in society?
I think so. There's definitely a lesson to be learned, but I think there's also something missing from the discourse here, particularly in France. The protests obviously have to be welcomed, and then the government's response. But you know that there's black, brown and migrant communities on the edge of Paris who riot all the time for definite legitimate political reasons. Their condition, brutality they face doesn't make the news. No one talks about it. Politicians don't seem to applaud it. So
you're saying that this is only happening because a certain group within society in France were protesting.
Yeah.
But then the protest did get out of hand because, you know, whilst Mr. President was away, shops were looted, buildings were burnt. So it did get quite dangerous though, didn't it, Lloyd?
Of course. I mean, action, reaction. You have to
You've just become French all of a sudden.
Become French. You have to think about whatever action you're putting in place, what is the reaction? We talked about contingency, but when you're putting a strategy in place with good intent, climate change, but then think it through and figure out what impact is it going to have, not just on government, but the everyday man. After all, who are you doing it for? You know, so I'm not surprised. Again, I love it. The people have spoken and the government has listened.
But then there was a safety issue with relation to Kenya, you know, and that was probably what fueled it in the first instance. So the safety issue is now suspended, and we're back to having to go back to how things were because, you know, there were 20,000 minibuses on the road. That's quite a lot when you think about it, and you know, people were getting hit and so on. And this was an attempt to protect the public.
It's a very important issue, the environment, but for me it can't be more important than the livelihoods of poor people who rely on a service to get into the cities and back again. As important as the environment is, the well-being and livelihoods and the ability of people to feed their families and commute, it takes a higher priority for me than the environmental issue, which is of course a huge concern, but I think it's a question of priorities here.
People's livelihoods, I suppose. But you know, going back to the French situation, Macron came in, the whole world was saluting him, everybody was happy. But I think it's fair to say that, you know, in the last 6 months especially, the people of France have not been particularly happy with him. Is this the fall of the whole Macron? Are we now falling out of love with him?
I mean, well, for French people, he was booed when he came back. He didn't exactly receive the best welcome. And some of the, you know, when I was seeing the images that were coming out of France, a lot of the comments I was hearing was like, oh my gosh, is that France? Like,
yeah, is that Macron?
This is chaos.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think that French people have, if they were in love with him, fallen out of love with him. I mean, I guess a lot of people probably fell out of love with him when they found out how much he spends on makeup. Did you hear about that story? His makeup bill is ridiculous. Just the overspending that's going on. And I think we've had this theme today of just, you know, the voice of people being making a difference. And it's a good thing in this case.
Educate though, explain the why. I think that's one thing they miss. You know, educate.
The governments are not explaining the why to people.
Talk to people, explain the why, and involve people as well. Make them part of whatever change it is that you're bringing in. It helps people understand that you know their pain points and what they're going through.
Isn't it great we can talk about an African country as well, though, where people, something isn't working and only in a matter of days it changes. That's something we're more used to in the West, that happening.
You know, it's brought me to think that, are we now in this era now where governments will be, you know, we're seeing it with Brexit, we're seeing it, as you mentioned there, in Kenya, we're seeing it in France. Are governments now going to have to share more of the whys and share more of the reasons why they're doing things with people? Is there going to be more of a conversation? You know, we've often had governments do things and then, but are we going to see a change in the way government deal with their people now?
I hope so. I mean, the question is what change? I mean, I think we're seeing the limitations or the traditional way that liberal democracies work. We're seeing the nation states and the concept of them really being challenged. Will governments respond? They definitely will, but the question is how are they going to respond? We've seen a lot of governments decisively swinging to the right as we've had a problem with economies around Europe. So the people are talking. It's arguable as to whether or not the politicians are actually listening, I think.
But I mean, are we likely to see it, for instance, becoming a trend? So across Africa, for instance, like you said, for the first time we're seeing this happening in Kenya. Are we likely to see other African countries stepping up and saying, you know, before the people get protesting, let's do the right thing and explain the why? Or are we likely to see more people, the population if you like, saying let's hold our politicians more accountable than we did before?
Well, you would hope so. A lot of people would talk about the fact that Africa needs its own Africa Spring, the way we saw in Arab countries, country by country, just, toppling leaders, toppling terrible leadership that has caused so much disruption in the country. I think that it would be great if people were to look at what's happened in Kenya. Although I don't think Kenyans were heavily protesting, you can't compare it to what was going on in France, but we definitely do need to speak up with certain things a lot more than we do.
I mean, it's interesting you should say that. And just on the back of what I just said, that question, Donald Trump, I think the world's favorite president, decided to congratulate Macron for backtracking. But we know that since his arrival in the US, we've seen protest after protest after protest on so many different issues, but he's never backtracked on anything.
I mean,
people power there is not having an effect on him.
People might disagree with me, but I don't see that many ideological differences between Macron and Trump, maybe in rhetoric at least. When we talk about Macron, the thing that keeps coming back to me is this is the head of state in France. France is a former colonial entity. He went to Africa and said the problem with Africa is leadership. Now, don't get me wrong, there's questions about leadership, but that's a conversation for Africans to have amongst themselves, not the leader of France to come along. The elephant in the room here, I think, is also outside meddling, financial institutions, the IMF, the loan system in Africa. These are the questions too. I think we can take the words of leaders with a pinch of salt, particularly if they're from countries that used to have a checkered history in Africa, a history of colonialism.
They used to. Don't you think they still do? But we're not going to talk about that now. But Trump congratulated Macron.
But when we talk about the media and access that people have now, I think it's also helping. We talked about fake news, etc., etc. I think people having access to this digital age has really helped to get the people's voices out there. And regardless of what we think, it is making a change. Leaders are paying attention and doing something about it. Backtracking, it's a start.
I agree with you. As I said earlier, before it gets out on social media, before it's pumped for the world to hear, are they going to do better?
Well, also, why do people in positions of power wait until problems escalate to the point of this is just disaster zone? Kenya didn't overnight suddenly have 20,000 plus minibuses in Nairobi. This is a problem that has existed, and then in just almost a day, say they just want to change things, and they haven't considered what will be the implication of this. I think that's ludicrous. How you can have people in power that don't understand the decisions that they make, the bills that they stamp affect real people.
But we do have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. We have so much more, so don't go away. Hello and welcome back to JHUK. I'm Priscilla Winkwa and I'm pleased to welcome back our panel. Members of the US Congress are calling on the Rwandan government to drop charges against Diane Rwigara, who is a fierce government critic and facing up to 22 years in prison on charges of incitement and fraud after challenging the longtime president in last year's general election. Rwanda leads the world with its fair share of women in politics, but in daily life, it can still be hard to be a woman there. Well, what can I say? Rwanda has always been celebrated as that country that, has women in its government. And they're not just there, but they've been training and advising other countries on how to have women in their government. So then, when a story like this, runs with Diane Rwigara, you can't help but wonder what is going on. Now, I know that you've had a conversation with her, so I'm going to come to you first, Eno. What do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I was hounding poor Diane and her family trying to get this interview with her because I was so fascinated by her story, and because Paul Kagame is almost this darling of the West that was able to go into Rwanda and change the economy, provide jobs and you know, bring women into power. But it's not tough to be a woman in Rwanda. It's tough to be a person with an opposing voice to the president. Paul Kagame has routinely locked people up. People like Diane. Diane didn't even get the chance to actually run in the election. She was locked up, so was her mother, so was her brother, so was people guilty by association for simply wanting to run against the president. And all these charges that were brought against her, then
I mean,
it's
it's interesting you should say that, because she was disqualified ahead of last year's elections. And at the end of that election, Paul Kagame, the current president, won with 98% of the vote. It just makes me think of Cameroon, you know, and what is going on there. But what are your thoughts on this, Richard?
Anytime you see like a public figure of prominence that people start to listen to, that are like challenging the nature of power, there's always an ad hominem attack, whether or not it's legitimate. You know, they'll attack the person to discredit the idea. And I think more and more around the world, you're seeing women taking more and more leading roles in society. You see it in places like Afghanistan, Scandinavia as well. And I think there's an innate fear from that, actually, from kind of male privilege at the top of the chain. They're very scared about losing their power. So I wonder how much that plays into this story too.
I think it's interesting you should raise that, Richard. You know, that it's the men that are getting concerned about the uprising of women. Is it really a fear of the woman rising up that is causing this? Because in the case of Rwanda, he's not just put women away. I believe some men have also been put away for attempting to run in the general election.
This is a really sad story for me, because when I've spoken, when I go out there and I speak, I put Rwanda out there as an example in terms of women being in power. And when people talk about this female movement we have now with women having voices, Rwanda is a typical example. So it's really, really sad to hear this. And I think there's a conflict for me, because then you have this president who is seen to be championing women, and then this happening. And you're absolutely right, Richard, when I think when you have people who are raising their voices and opposing, the reaction is to shut them down. And you see this in a lot of African leaders, I'm sorry to say, and being sort of dictators and not wanting to be opposed and rule forever.
I think it's wrong to call him a champion of women. He's locked up so many women.
It does appear to be that, though, in the West. That's presented.
For most people who hear of or see Paul Kagame, he's a president that's working for his country. Yeah. Rwanda is voted as one of the best places to live in Africa. I think it's at #1, and I think in the world it measures quite high. So to most people, yes, Rwanda is fantastic. Paul Kagame is doing great. He's fabulous. So to hear this, so when you say, oh, we can't, say that of him, but then it's almost like this coin of his have both very strong sides, don't they, really?
But Rwandans are not exactly living a life of luxury either. That even if, if someone comes into power and there are things that are done, there are still lots of things that aren't in place. Yeah. This woman is facing more than 20 years in prison, and even when I spoke to her, she has no faith that she will be released, and she still was able to tell me that when she is released, she still has ambitions to make sure the lives of common Rwandans are improved. And that's the point. If he's a champion of women, he's stopping someone that wants to do something good for the country. I just think that we haven't dug in deep enough to know what's going on with Paul Kagame. I don't think Paul Kagame's name would be listed if we were talking about dictators around the world, and his name should be.
You know when they say absolute power corrupts, and he's obviously been in office for quite some time. Does it have any influence on him probably believing that he can get away with it?
Maybe, but I think also if you know, a person's arguments are legitimate whether or not they're corrupt. And if people are being rounded up and people are saying, well, they're corrupt and this is happening, then why go to the trouble of discrediting all their political views at the same time?
Interesting. Well, we're going to move on to another situation, still with women, but this time we're going to Australia, because an Australian journalist was thrown out of Parliament for showing too much skin and told to cover up. The Speaker of the House later said in hindsight, she should not have been asked to leave. It's almost like we can't win. The pictures are up of how she was dressed. First of all, what do you think of the way she was dressed? Can we really classify the way she was dressed to be too much skin?
See, I'm up for dressing for the occasion. You have to dress appropriately for the occasion. And when you look at this woman, I think she's dressed really well as a journalist. But as you know, there was also an MP who'd actually been in the House as well, I think not the same time, but they showed what she was wearing, which actually was a lot more revealing than what the journalist is wearing. So again, that is really upsetting, like, in this day and age.
You know, Richard, it's easy for us as women to sit here and go, oh, it's no big deal. But I mean, from a man's standpoint, are you in any way, is she showing too much arm? Because that's all I can see at the moment. It's arm and just a bit of neck and lots of face. Is that too much?
Whether you're a man or a woman, I think this story is utterly ridiculous. And the first thing to say, actually, is that the government has, first of all, admitted they're wrong, first of all.
Yeah.
They've backtracked on it.
True.
But the other thing is, I think people are generally sick and tired of old white stuffy men, politicians dictating how women wear and what clothes they can wear. And actually you see it around the world. There's a right-wing demagogue here called Boris Johnson, who used to be London mayor, and he seems to be obsessed with women's clothing. So I think that's the bigger question there. Why are these old, predominantly white politicians so obsessed
middle-aged
with what women are wearing? Why, you know?
It worries me. It's a concern for me. That's what you can't want. You'll be distracted from the job you're meant to be doing.
Is it fair to say that maybe he was having a bad day? I'm not defending him, but I mean,
I don't care if he's having a bad day.
He's having a bad day. It's not anyone's fault.
Can you imagine if he's having a bad day and has to make a decision that impacts the country?
But you know, he has said that in hindsight, he should never have asked her to leave. Is it then possible that perhaps the issue goes beyond what she was wearing? Maybe they've had conversations previously, prior engagements that were not kind or pleasant.
Perhaps
should hold that against her then.
But the thing is, we're talking about the here and now. Whether you've had prior conversations, I don't particularly care about that. But actually, somebody who's dressed appropriately and in a place of the people for the people. I mean, that was wrong.
She's there to
Simple.
she's there to do a job. You know, even people saying, you know, it's a hot country. Even if the air conditioning was turned all the way up, she still has a right as a woman to be able to decide what she's wearing.
This is in Parliament, and there is a dress code in Parliament. In any Parliament in the world, there is a dress code, and I think she was required to wear a jacket.
I think that goes back to what Richard was saying as well, though, in the fact that who's making up who's deciding what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate to wear, and why is it this is only a burden that women have to carry?
One point, sorry, just quickly. These parliaments are places of privilege, and there's a particular demographic, actually, of people that are in these parliaments, and so their standards of what are appropriate are entirely subjective. And I dare say there's probably, I don't know, there could be an element of class in this, but you know, this is just about the sensibilities of people who are kind of out of touch with reality have been offended. And as a result, a woman who is trying to do her job, an important job, has been kicked out of her place of work. I think it's quite serious, actually.
You have that MP. Again, I go back to that, where if this is her place of work as well, and she was wearing something similar, if not slightly more revealing in the arms. So why wasn't she kicked out as an MP?
Well, that's all we have time for this week on this edition of JHUK. There's just enough time for me to say a big thank you to Eno. Pleasure to have you here. Shalom, thank you for being here. And of course, Richard, the only man in our midst.
Thank you.
We welcome you. Thank you. Don't forget to follow us at The Real JHUK on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. I'm Priscilla Wigbo, and from the entire team here in London, goodbye and thank you for watching.